City Skylines 2 was released more than 1,000 days ago, and we are still talking about when it will finally be truly finished. Since then, its performance has improved, mods, bicycles, and region packs have arrived, and the game has received its first major expansion. On the surface, then, it may look as though the game is finally heading in the right direction. But there is another side to this story. A base game released in an unfinished state. A paid content pack whose approval rating fell as low as 4%. Features delayed for years. A console version that vanished from sight. Expansions repeatedly pushed back. And finally, a change of developer that effectively brought the Colossal Orders we had known for 15 years to an end. Meanwhile, Paradox turned every minor big fix into a grandly named event, while the community is still waiting for the game to be not merely repaired but meaningfully expanded. So in this video, I am not going to repeat what you have already heard 100 times in marketing materials and enthusiastic previews. I am going to talk about what they don't tell you about City Skylines 2. How did we get from the promise of the next generation of city building games to where we are today? And does this game still have a real future? So let's dive in. To understand what happened to City Skylines 2, we need to go all the way back to the beginning of the story. According to the Colossal Order, development of City Skylines 2 began back in 2018 or 2019, but the project was kept completely secret for almost 5 years. It was not officially revealed until 6th of March 2023 during the Paradox announcement show. The circumstances of the announcement alone showed just how important Paradox considered City Skylines 2. As I remember it, this was the biggest attraction of the entire event. The reveal was met with surprise and genuine applause. Everyone accepted more than a simple sequel. Though we were about to see the next generation of city building games. At the same time, we were, in a sense, saying goodbye to the original City Skylines. During the final major phase of that game, expansion and content packs arrived one after another, as if the developers wanted to give it everything they had before making way for the sequel. Fortunately, we have since learned that the first game is far from dead. The community continues to keep it alive, and it has even received new content. City Skylines 2 was eventually released on 24 October of 2013. More than 1,000 days later, we can see fairly clearly that although it cannot be called a complete failure, its history has been turbulent, to put it mildly. The first cracks were visible even before launch. Many fans were disappointed to learn that the game would not use Unreal Engine but Unity, just like its predecessor. Of course, using Unity does not automatically make a game bad. The real question was whether Colossal Order could properly optimize a city simulation of this scale and complexity on that technical foundation. With hindsight, we know that the problem was not simply which engine logo appeared when the game started. The real issue was that the launch version was not ready to provide an enjoyable city building experience, let alone serve as a foundation to which the developers could add new content and gameplay mechanics. Another major change was the decision to abandon the Steam workshop. Paradox chose its own system, Paradox Mods, which could theoretically work across different platforms. The idea had some logic behind it, but the system was not completed on time. The game launched without the full mod support that had been one of the original game's most important features, and support for custom assets did not arrive until December 2025. All of this might still have been forgivable if the game itself had arrived in good condition, but its performance problems became obvious within the first few hours. It launched with brutal system requirements and still failed to run properly even on powerful computers. There were problems with its graphics, its simulations, and several times that appeared far more sophisticated on paper than they provide to be in practice. The development priorities also seemed rather strange. The game included an extremely detailed yet cumbersome photography system. The problem is not that a photo mode exists. The problem is that while a great deal of time had clearly been devoted to it, fundamental city building options were still missing. The same is true of several systems highlighted before release. In 2023, the PC Gamer preview mentioned rat infestations, which were also supposed to have their own achievement. This public health problem never appeared in the release game, and the related achievement was later quietly removed. Fortunately, the internet does not forget. The original reports will show that more complex urban problems were being suggested before release than what we ultimately received. Other features shown early on did make it into the game. Railway stations can be expanded with extra platforms, a metro connection, and bus and taxi facilities. Their locations and layouts, however, are predetermined. As a result, station can be supplemented with a few fixed functions rather than being actually designed with freedom. It would be wonderful to build modular intermodal hubs like those shown in the Transport Fever Free preview, where we decide which platforms, tracks, and modes of transport should sit alongside one another. Even the original City Skylines offered integrated hubs where metro, monorail, and railway service appeared within the same station on neighboring tracks. In this area, the sequel therefore feels less like progress and more like a step backwards. Meanwhile, the publisher was already planning paid content. The earliest released window for bridges and ports that can still be reliably documented was the second quarter of 2024. But I distinctly remember an earlier plan that placed in the fourth quarter of 2023, although I can no longer prove that with a source. Perhaps other players remember it as well. What we do know is that the expansion was postponed several times and was not released until October 29, 2025, around 16 months after the documented window and almost 2 years after the base game. The consequences of the unfinished launch, questionable development priorities, and an impossible schedule soon become visible in the player numbers. City Skylines 2 lost players extremely quickly. On launch day, it set its Steam peak with nearly 105,000 concurrent players. By December 2023, however, its average concurrent player count had fallen to around 21,000. These figures do not measure exactly the same thing. One is a momentary peak, while the other is an average across an entire month, but they still illustrate the dramatic decline in interest. It can hardly have been welcome news for Paradox that less than 2 months after launch, the monthly average was already only around 1/5 of the launch day peak. And the decline did not stop at 20,000. Over the following years, the average player count generally fluctuated between 6 and 10,000, increasing only temporarily around major updates, new content, or free weekends. At the same time, City Skylines 2 developed a remarkably loyal core audience of several thousand players. They remained with the game despite its technical problems, delays, and disappointing content. But that alone does not represent a genuine recovery. The player count stabilized at a match power post-launch level, and so far the game has failed to move beyond it for any sustained period. It is worth remembering that the original City Skylines also experienced a significant decline in players after release. The difference is not that the first game had a core audience while the sequel does not. The difference is that City Skylines managed to use that stable foundation to build an expanding game and an entire ecosystem. Regular expansions, updates, and modes repeatedly reactivated the existing audience while also attracting new players. Its growth was never constant nor linear, but the original game was able to regain momentum again and again. City Skylines 2 has a loyal audience, but it has yet to prove that it can build an equally long-lived and continuously renewed game on top of it. And this brings us to one of the biggest problems with City Skylines 2. The game has truly improved in many areas, but more than 1,000 days after release, it still cannot be considered a truly complete city planning game. I will explain exactly why in a separate video. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way we will meet again when we examine what turns to a city builder into a genuine city planning game, and what City Skylines 2 is still missing. The true low point of the story arrived on 25 March 2024. That was the release date of the first paid content pack, the Beach Properties Asset Pack, which, despite its name, contained no actual beaches at all. We received 2 waterfront residential zones, 60 growable residential buildings, 6 signature buildings, and 4 palm trees. These were advertised as 70 new assets, and the asking price was €9.99. In other words, another €10 for a game that already cost around 50 was still struggling with serious bugs and missing basic features. Owners of the Ultimate Edition received the pack, of course, because it was included in the nearly €90 edition. But the outrage was not caused by the price alone. The first public version of the official modding system launched on the same day, and it was still very clearly in beta. Initially, it supported only maps and code mods, while downloading, updating, and running mods together caused numerous problems. The new system intended to replace the Steam Workshop had therefore not been completed either for the game's launch or 5 months later. At the poor content and difficult to defend pricing of beach properties, and the result was dramatic. At its lowest point, the Steam approval rating for beach properties hovered at around 4%. At the time, several outlets described it as one of the lowest rated products in Steam history. Whether it was literally the worst would be difficult to prove, and frankly, it does not matter. 4% tell us everything we need to know about how players received the first paid content for City Skylines 2. This was no longer merely criticism of a content pack. It was a protest against the entire way City Skylines 2 had been handled up to that point. On April 18, 2024, Paradox and Colossal Orders effectively admitted that they had made a serious mistake. Their statement said that they had tried to address the base game's shortcomings within an unrealistic timeframe while rushing out a paid pack that should never have been released in that state. The beach properties content was added to the base game on April 25, making it free for every owner. Players who had purchased the pack separately received refunds where possible. Owners of the Ultimate Edition were compensated with free additional content packs and free radio stations released in March 2025. The game's reputation reached its lowest point in the first half of 2024, while the free region packs promised in the autumn of 2023 were still nowhere to be seen. They only began to appear in October 2024. The French pack was followed by the German, UK, Japan, East European and China packs, then by the two USA collections. A Dutch building pack was added later. The region packs genuinely helped with the extremely limited selection of buildings that had made almost every city look the same at launch. What is strange, however, is that the game's visual variety has receded largely not by Colossal Order's own content, but by the work of well-known community creators. Meanwhile, the developer continued to improve the base game. Economy 2.0 arrived, along with more decorating options and a number of smaller parks and service buildings. These additions made the game more usable and somewhat more varied, but they could not restore the trust lost at launch. In the eyes of many players, City Skylines 2 remained unfinished and poorly optimized. And two permanent specters continued to haunt the game: bicycles and the console versions. Bicycles finally arrived on November 19, 2025, but the console edition has still not been released. According to the official explanation, its performance and stability have yet to reach the required level. While everyone was still waiting for these major promises to be fulfilled, increasing pressure fell on the first truly large-scale expansion. Bridges and ports no longer had to merely provide new content. It also had to prove that the development of City Skylines 2 was finally capable of moving forward. All eyes turned to this expansion. After 2 years of repairs, repeated delays and lost trust, Bridges and Ports was supposed to become the turning point in the game's history. On October 29, 2025, Bridges and Ports finally arrived. The first major City Skylines 2 expansion to contain genuinely new gameplay mechanics. But the breakthrough players had awaited for 2 years' fate to materialize once again. I have already made a separate video about the expansion, so I will focus on only its most important problem here. The developers still did not seem to understand exactly what the game and its players needed most. You can clearly feel the desire for City Skylines 2 to be more than a modernized version of its predecessor. That is an understandable goal. But in pursuing it, the developers also avoided directions that had already proved successful. Transport in the first game gradually placed more emphasis on fixed track systems. We received trams, monorails, new metro and railway solutions, and transport hubs. By contrast, the sequel's first major expansion was built around bridges, ports, ferries, and maritime industries. All of those things naturally have a place in a modern city builder. We needed better bridges, usable quays, and customizable ports. The real question is whether this should have been the first major expansion when a significant part of the community wanted more flexible railways, metros, and tram, as well as genuinely intermodal transport hubs. One specialized area received a massive package, while several fundamental problems affecting everyday city building remained unresolved. In practice, however, we often spend 5 or 10 minutes adjusting the terrain, the shipping lane, the bridge approaches, and the bridge itself before the game finally accepts the structure. An operation that should be simple and intuitive can easily become a frustrating sequence of attempts. So it can present a serious challenge, especially without a proper tutorial. Alongside the steep learning curve, the sheer size of the expansion is another problem. Bridges and Ports attempted to squeeze 20 movable bridges, customizable ports, ferries, maritime industries, fishing, oil extractions, pipelines, more than 100 assets and 5 maps into a single package. That sounds impressive at first, but the result lacks focus. It might have been better to create separate bridges and ports expansions, each exploring its own area in genuine depth. Nor did the reception justify 2 years of waiting for a €20 expansion. At the time of making this video, only 54% of its Steam reviews were positive, leaving it in the mixed category. This is not a beach property style catastrophe, of course. Bridges and Ports added many visually impressive and useful elements to the game. For me, however, it remains a missed opportunity because it did not focus on what would have made a real difference to the greatest number of players. What began to improve the game's position was not this €20 expansion by itself, but the free content released around it. The Dutch region pack arrived. The Old Town Zone came alongside bicycles. Support for custom assets followed in December. On December 3rd, 2 more creator packs, supply chains, and skyscrapers expanded the selection with impressive industrial buildings and enormous towers. Once again, however, these were the work of community creators Padidea and Revo. By the end of 2025, Cities Skylines 2 was definitely a much better and richer game than it had been at launch. The strange thing is that this was due less to its first major expansion, delayed for 2 years, than to free updates and content packs made by community creators. But just as the game was slowly beginning to find its feet, a separation was already taking shape behind the scenes, one that would fundamentally change the future of the entire Cities Skylines franchise. Before we had even recovered from the mixed reception of Bridges and Ports, major news shook the community on November 17, 2025. After more than 15 years of collaboration, Paradox Interactive and Colossal Orders were going their separate ways. The official announcement was remarkably peaceful. According to the two companies, they had reached the decision together after careful consideration. In practice, however, Colossal Order lost its role as developer of the Cities franchise. The brand had already been under Paradox control, so legally this was not a case of the publisher suddenly taking ownership of the games away from the studio. The practical consequence was still dramatic. The studio had created Cities in Motion, Cities in Motion 2, and both Cities Skylines games could no longer work on the series that had defined it for 15 years. We cannot know how mutual the separation truly was. What we do know is that the franchise remained with Paradox while Colossal Orders departed without the creation for which it was best known. In effect, Paradox brought the Colossal Orders we had known to an end. The company still legally exists and, according to its own statement, is looking for new projects. But it has not announced a new game since then, so at present we cannot know what future the studio may have. For me, this raises a serious question. How could the team that successfully created both Cities in Motion games and developed Cities Skylines for nearly a decade fail to manage the sequel properly? Without inside information, we can only draw conclusions. In my view, both sides may have made serious mistakes. Paradox may have created an unrealistic schedule from the outset. Alongside an unfinished base game, the team was expected to improve performance and the simulations, complete the modding system, the asset editor, and the console version, while at once producing new paid content. That was not merely poor scheduling, it was an impossible assignment. Colossal Order, on the other hand, may have misplaced its priorities. A disproportionate amount of time went into certain technical and visual features, while several fundamental city planning options were missing. A breakup of this scale was probably preceded by declining communication and numerous conflicts invisible to the public. We can speculate about which party ultimately decided that the relationship had to end, but we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Paradox is not particularly sentimental when a project fails to meet its expectations. The story of Live by You demonstrates this very clearly. With that game, the publisher attempted to enter one of Electronic Arts' last major markets without a serious challenger, the live simulation genre dominated by The Sims. It even established a separate development studio, Paradox Tectonic, specifically for the project. But after several delays, Live by You still refused to come together. In June 2024, Paradox not only cancelled development of the game, but shut down the entire studio. This made one thing clear: when the publishers lose confidence in a project, it does not necessarily settle for changing the schedule or replacing its management. It may dismantle the entire development team. Since Colossal Order is an independent company, Paradox could not simply close it down. But by taking away development of the franchise, it deprived the studio of the series that had defined its existence for the previous 15 years. The fossiled creature in the Paradox logo therefore shows no mercy. If a project does not perform, sooner or later the wrecking ball arrives. Development of City Skylines 2 passed to Iceflake Studios at the beginning of 2026. It took responsibility for every present and future test. Pre-updates, new expansions for the development of the editor, and even the console version should that ever finally be completed. Paradox therefore replaced the studio that had created and cared for the series for more than a decade. But can Iceflake truly solve the problems that ultimately brought Colossal Orders down? From the moment Iceflake was announced, my biggest concern was that the studio had never proved itself on a project the size of City Skylines. Its only major reference point in city building and management games is Surviving the Aftermath. It is an interesting post-apocalyptic city builder serving a niche audience and currently holds a mostly positive rating of 72%. That is not a bad result, but neither is it the kind of outstanding success that make it self-evident that the same team can take over one of the genre's most important franchises. An important difference is that Colossal Order was an independent external partner, while Iceflake has been an internal studio owned by Paradox since 2020. Put simply, the publisher can exercise much more direct control over it. We do not know how many people are currently working on the game. Judging by the results so far, either the team is relatively small or the developers are still busy with learning Colossal Order's complex systems. Most likely, there is some truth in both explanations. Iceflake inherited a game burdened with technical debt and faulty systems, so it would be unreasonable to accept miracles within a few weeks. Based on its first 8 months, however, the studio has so far been completing mainly the work that simply had to be done. Paradox represents this work through a communication series called City Corner. 11 of these posts have appeared since January 2026. It is important to understand that they do not represent 11 separate updates. They are development reports, often presenting different parts of the same upcoming patch. In my view, that is one of the main purposes of the series: to present the routine repair of an already released game as continuous activity. Updates receive names such as First Frost, Morning Dew, Spring Cleaning, or Autumn Breeze, making every smaller change feel like a larger event. But when we place the actual contents of the city corners side by side, the picture becomes much more modest. In my opinion, the two most useful additions are the ability to recolor buildings and the planned changes to zoning. The other improvements are useful, but if we compare them with other city building or tycoon games, they look essentially like routine necessities. In today's Steam market, regular bug fixing is not an extraordinary achievement. It is a basic obligation, especially for a game that launched with major problems. Nearly 3 years after release, we should no longer be waiting for the developers to make refuse trucks route correctly, prevent demand from collapsing, or get tree detail working properly. Those things should have been in order at launch. The city corners improve the experience, but in many cases they merely place a sticking plaster over deeper problems. The trees become prettier, light behaves more naturally, and windows can become more varied, but the game still offers few genuine city planning challenges. City Skylines 2 is therefore primarily about building beautiful cities. But if that is the game's main attractions, it needs a continuous supply of new buildings, assets, transport options, and decorations. Iceflake's own contribution in this area has so far been modest. Its only clearly original new building is the Iceflake Arena. The Office Evolution and City Stations creator packs released in March 2025 were made by community creators. Iceflake was mainly responsible for their technical integration. City Stations genuinely filled an important gap, while the Office Evolution can best be described as a layered creator pack. Meanwhile, Paradox uses grand names and lot of separate posts to make the volume of completed work appear greater. The process is divided into small fixes, each given an impressive title, then presented as though the game were constantly reaching major milestones. Put more simply, they are using marketing to make very little look like a great deal. That does not mean Iceflake is approaching the task carelessly. The team is probably working at full capacity, but perhaps it does not have enough people, perhaps it still lacks experience with the system, or perhaps the inherited technical foundations are in worse condition than they appear from the outside. Based on the results so far, however, Iceflake appears capable primarily of maintaining the game rather than meaningfully expanding it. At the end of the 11th City Corner, Paradox promised that the coming months would bring news about new content and DLC. The real question then is not when the 12th grandly titled post will appear, it is when we will finally see evidence that Iceflake is capable not merely of repairing City Skylines 2, but of genuinely moving it forward. Despite all my criticism so far, I believe that City Skylines 2, however slowly, is beginning to move onto a path that could eventually make it worthy of its predecessor. Its overall Steam rating remains mixed, but recent reviews are now mostly positive. That is real progress. Anyone returning to the game today will have a significantly better experience than they would have had in the autumn of 2023. Even so, the pace of development is difficult to defend. The original City Skylines received 5 major expansions within 3 years, adding new systems and city building possibilities. In almost the same amount of time, the sequel has progressed only as far as bridges and ports. Why its content development has been kept moving mainly by region packs and community-made creator packs. City Skylines 2 is no longer a dead or unplayable game. Its performance has improved considerably, its visual variety has increased, and it is slowly emerging from the pariah status created by its disastrous launch. But what it needs now is genuine development of its content. Iceflake's next DLCs could therefore be decisive. If the studio proves that it can do more than repair the game, that it can meaningfully expand it, City Skylines 2 may yet become a worthy sequel. But if we continue to receive mainly minor fixes, community packs, and grandly named marketing, the original game will remain in its shadow for a long time, or perhaps even ahead of it. So yes, there really is light at the end of the tunnel. But after almost 3 years, it would be nice if we finally reached it.